The Toyota Camry is one of the most recognizable names in the car business, and it's probably not going away anytime soon.
But a really strong case can be made to discontinue the gas-only versions, leaving this hybrid as the only Camry you can buy, which is actually not a bad thing because this car's got a lot going on. Kind of like our shirts.
Okay, first things first, Jodi, I am so excited that you are here for this review.
I'm really excited to be here. It's the first one I've done in a while, so I'll try to ease in slowly.
So for those of you who don't know, Jodi is autoTRADER.ca's editor-in-chief, otherwise known as my boss, and I have been bugging her for months to please join me in a review. Let's do a review together, and she was a little bit apprehensive. It's been a while since she's done a video review, but I finally convinced her with the most exciting car in the world.
This is the 2020 Toyota Camry Hybrid XLE. That means it's the fully loaded version, and this uses the same 4-cylinder engine as every other Camry except for the V6 model, but it adds a bigger battery pack and an electric motor so you can have some gas-free driving.
Yeah, so this hybrid system, it is one that Toyota's been using for years. It's a 2.5-liter 4-cylinder, like you said, same one that's in the gas-powered 4-cylinder model, but it pairs with an electric motor up front as well as that battery pack in the back. It's a 1 kilowatt-hour battery pack, but it's interesting because the base version of the hybrid, which is an LE, that comes with a lithium-ion battery pack, which is kind of the more modern battery technology. When you step up to the SE or this XLE version, you get a nickel metal hydride battery, which is just kind of interesting that they use a different battery depending on the trim.
I wonder if it's to keep costs a bit lower because the lithium-ion one would be an additional cost, right?
Yeah, definitely, but it's interesting that for a more expensive vehicle, you're getting the cheaper battery or one that's been around for longer. And then, like we said, so you've got that 4-cylinder engine, but output has been scaled down. So in the gas-powered version, it makes 203 horsepower and I think 185 pound-feet of torque. In this one, the gas motor on its own makes 175 horsepower, 163 pound-feet of torque, but then that's paired with a 650 volt electric motor. And that makes 118 horsepower and 169 pound-feet of torque on its own. So the net system output is 208 horsepower. So it's competitive with the 4-cylinder version. Going over that 200 horsepower mark is a pretty big deal for a hybrid and for kind of the base motor to begin with. If you look at the Subaru Legacy, if you look at the Honda Accord, they all don't hit the 200 horsepower mark with their base motors. So this thing, not only the conventional gas version, but this hybrid, both of them have more than 200 horsepower.
Yeah, and I think that's great because with this generation of Toyota Camry, Toyota really wanted to be a lot more sporty, and I think that powertrain really matches the chassis and suspension setup they have going here, and so it's just really good.
Yeah.
I remember Camry hybrids being a little bit sloppy before. They were not fun to drive at all. I'm not saying this one's a sports car, but it has a certain sportiness to it that I think a lot of people can appreciate just because it feels so dialed in. It's just so nice.
Okay, but first things first, let's cover the powertrain and the refinement. And since you're behind the wheel, you go first. Tell me what you think, and I'll go after you.
Okay, so one of the first things that first stood out to me about the powertrain was how smooth it is. So you don't notice when the gas engine comes online. The transition between electric and gas modes is extremely smooth. You can't feel it. At idle, you go in EV mode, so you don't feel any rough idling or anything like that. It's just really well put together.
For sure, and I think there's also something to be said about not just that smoothness in the transition, but then even when the gas engine kicks in, you don't feel it so much. So when you use the same powertrain in the Highlander, because it's moving so much more mass, I think it's about 1,000 kilograms heavier than this, and you really feel it mostly you hear it. When you get on that gas pedal, you're merging on the highway or you go to pass someone, you can really hear it kick in because it's got all that extra weight to move. But in this thing, it feels so perfectly matched to the weight and the size of this Camry. So it's just like that really smooth linear acceleration, and it doesn't sound like it's working super hard, which I dig a lot.
Yeah, so what I really like about the Camry Hybrid is that it feels pretty effortless to drive. Like a lot of times with hybrids, you know, you gun it to pass someone on the highway and you're just really struggling to get there, but the Camry does it, no big deal, no drama.
And I think probably that has a lot to do with the fact that this gas engine is the same one that comes in the 4-cylinder, so it is kind of tailor-made to this car. It just also benefits from that electric motor in the battery pack to cut down on your fuel consumption, which is an awesome bonus. So some other stuff to talk about. You touched on the suspension. I'm going to tell you what I think and you tell me how close I am.
Okay, go.
I feel just a little bit of Chrysler 300 with some added dynamism.
Yes and no. So like I drove the Chrysler 300 not too long ago and it was like the softest car I have ever driven. It was very soft, borderline sloppy driving dynamics. This is soft without being sloppy and sporty without being too harsh or crashy. So it really straddles that line nicely.
For sure, and that's what I mean. It just takes a little bit of like a dynamic drive experience and adds it to that soft, cushy suspension. And part of that too is that the suspension damping in this model, because it's got all that extra weight, is different than the conventional version, and I love that about hybrids. I think it's one of those underrated aspects of a hybrid vehicle is that you get a huge gain in the suspension department, and guaranteed it's going to be softer than the conventional gas-powered version.
For sure, and like we mentioned earlier that we were trying to find potholes and rough roads to crash over, and like nothing upsets this Camry. It just rides it out so smoothly.
Yeah, I haven't been able to find anything this week that's upset it at all, and the same goes with the steering rack. Now, a big thing, I mean, we'll talk about steering feel, but for me, a big thing, a big sell is how true a steering rack will track. If you let your hands off the wheel for a second, is it going to start to drift or is it just going to track normal? And I find that this thing is just perfect, and it's also very easy to keep your speed moderated, which is huge.
So I love the steering feel of the Camry Hybrid. I feel like it's a lot better than the Accord Hybrid and the Sonata Hybrid. Again, it's that really nice middle zone where it's nice and there's some resistance and it's responsive, but it's not too heavy where you feel like you're fighting with it, kind of like in the Accord.
The Accord, definitely. That's something that I noticed. It takes such deliberate movement, which does have its merits, especially with a sportier tuned chassis. But in something like this, I think you want it just to be a little bit more compliant with a little bit of that weight and resistance. And the nice thing is, I think it's going to appeal to a lot of people because it's so approachable, because it's so usable. So it does have a little bit of that sportiness, but it's also got a ton of comfort. And that is very Camry.
Yeah, and the whole thing just comes together so nicely. Like it makes it very easy to drive and very effortless, which I love.
So is now a good time to talk about price?
I think so, go for it.
Okay, so this XLE version of the Camry Hybrid, it's priced at about 43 grand before tax.
Okay.
Which is very competitive with the Sonata Hybrid as well as the Accord Hybrid.
Right.
Here's my hang up, and you tell me what you think of this.
Okay.
To step up to this hybrid version is a $5,000 upgrade compared to the base front-wheel drive 4-cylinder in XLE trim.
Yeah.
Or a $3,000 step up from the all-wheel drive 4-cylinder.
That's a big bill to swallow, I think. That's quite the increase. And if you look at like the Sonata and how the Sonata Hybrid is only like $1,500 more than the regular fully loaded Sonata, that's a lot easier to swallow, I think.
Absolutely, and that's part of the thing. When I look at Toyota, if you look at something like the RAV4 or the Highlander, in the RAV4, it's anywhere from $1,500 to $2,000 to make the RAV4 a hybrid. In the Highlander, it's $2,000 no matter which trim. That's a lot more approachable. And the nice thing with something like the Highlander hybrid is that NRCan says it'll save you just over $900 a year in gas compared to the V6 version.
Right.
So really, within just over 2 years, you're gonna make that money back. In something like this, it's going to take you so much longer to amortize that extra cost.
Yeah, and by the time you get that cost back, you're going to get a new car, right?
Could you imagine? That's like 10 years of ownership.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying, yeah, Camry owners probably would keep their cars.
This is going to last forever.
For sure, but there's that issue with, are you willing to eat that upfront cost? And I just don't know that there's going to be enough of an appetite for people out there to say, yeah, I'm willing to pay more upfront and save that money monthly on my fuel bills.
Right, right. And that's why I kind of think that kind of goes back to our opening where we talked about this, how this hybrid should be the only one they offer.
I really think, and if you look at what Toyota's doing right now, right? You've been covering the news, you've been following the news. So the new Sienna.
Yep.
Hybrid only.
The new Venza, hybrid only.
Hybrid only. We've seen the Sienna, it's great, and I think it's really cool that Toyota's doing that. If you look across the pond in the UK, you can buy a Camry, but only a hybrid version. In North America, there's the 4-cylinder version, there's the 4-cylinder all-wheel drive, there's the V6, and then there's this hybrid version. And it's just a real logjam, and I think that's why there's so much disparity in that pricing model. But I think that's problematic because people are in that show me the money state when it comes to hybrids. Are you willing to pay more, that much more for something like this?
Not that much more.
And I think that's an issue here.
So I also wanted to point out how absolutely silent it is in here. You can't hear anything from outside.
Yeah, and that goes beyond the hybrid powertrain. That's just how much noise canceling is in this thing, how much sound deadening is in this thing, and it's really great. But speaking of which, can you just go ahead and turn that music up for me for a sec?
Oh my God.
Okay, that's exactly how I wanted this to go. Dumbest control layout ever.
I went through 2 knobs before I landed at the volume knob.
You're going climate,
yeah.
You're going tune, and then you finally get to volume. And here's my beef with that. Since the very first in-car radio, it's been as simple as volume on the left, tune on the right.
And then why did they go and do this?
Let's reinvent the wheel by putting these 2 knobs directly on top of each other and then adding a 3rd knob to confuse you. I get it, there are controls on the steering wheel, but this is as dumb as anything I've ever experienced.
This isn't great. You know what bothers me about that even more is that when the Camry first came out, I was able to talk to some of their designers, and they were telling me about how much effort they put into picking a new font for all these controls for the Camry. And I thought about how weird that is that they put so much effort into something like the font, but they get the knob placement wrong?
Yeah.
It makes no sense.
It's so bizarre to me, and I get that Toyota has really struggled with infotainment, but layout of controls has never really been an issue for Toyota. It's always been super clear, super easy to read, big buttons. You get some of that here, but it's like they've decided to take all the good that they've ever done over the years and just throw it right out the window with something so simple as knob placement.
Yeah, it's because I think with this generation Camry, they put a lot more emphasis on design rather than function.
For sure.
And so like, I love the way this looks. Like the design of the dash is very nice.
Yeah.
But yeah, that button placement just makes it a little bit, it could be more user-friendly.
For sure. But yeah, like you said, like the design in here is really nice. One thing I will say quickly though is this doesn't feel like the fully loaded model to me inside.
That's fair.
I just don't get that vibe. This leather is like, okay, the design is okay, but there's a lot of cheap plastic.
Yeah, right over here.
On the door, you know, some of this padding on the dash, this would be good in a Corolla, not in a Camry to me, and something over 40 grand, this does not meet my expectations.
Yeah, that's a good point too, especially when you compare it to something like the Sonata Hybrid, which is much newer, but like it has a much more luxurious interior with like the controls are just more luxurious, the materials are nicer, you know, even the layout makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. How about the exterior design?
So at first when the Camry came out, I didn't like it. It's really grown on me so far, although I will say that the one we have now is much better than that other really Predator looking face.
Yeah, the XSE.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that one.
Yeah, it's interesting, like this actually has a bigger single grille opening. That one's got the 3, but it just kind of looks a little bit more aggressive.
Yeah.
This one's a little bit more understated, and I love this color.
I think so too. It's funny because we were talking about how in some lights it looks blue and other lights it looks green, but it is a lovely color. So what kind of fuel economy are you getting right now?
Yeah, it's been right around 5.3 liters per 100 kilometers, which is impressive for a mid-size sedan.
That's pretty decent.
It's a little bit worse than what it's actually rated at, which I think is 5.1 liters per 100 kilometers. You can get a Camry Hybrid that dips down to like 4.9, but that has to do with the type of equipment you get and the extra weight that it's hauling around. Since this one's got all that extra tech, it's a little bit worse.
And I also wanted to mention that when I had the Sonata Hybrid, I was getting 4.7 liters per 100 kilometers, which is incredible. And I did that without even trying.
That's awesome. Now, I will say that once you get down to that point, that difference is pretty negligible. Unless it's something you want to brag about, I just don't really see much of a difference. Unless you're driving like, 50,000 kilometers a year and the savings are really going to add up. But even with this, if that's like half a liter per 100 kilometers, yeah, sure, it does add up over time, but not enough to make a huge difference in terms of your monthly fuel bill. So I'd say like, it is pretty negligible, especially when you consider that is newer technology. That Sonata Hybrid just came out. You were one of the first people in Canada to drive that thing, right? So, considering this is a little bit older, it's actually pretty competitive with that stuff. And then the same goes with pricing. So, to get back to that, that's my only real hang up with this car. I love the way it drives. I love the way the powertrain performs. I love this steering. Even this infotainment system is pretty easy to use minus those buttons. You've got Apple CarPlay and Android Auto.
Yeah.
You've
the
got satellite
graphics
radio.
look a little bit dated, but it works okay.
For sure, which is like, again, that's not Toyota's strength. So how simple it is a little bit laggy. And I hate that the maps that are built into this version, they look like MapQuest. Like, I don't understand how anyone could not use Google Maps in the year 2020. Like, if you're still using this,
it doesn't make any sense.
No, it's a waste of time. But then we get back to that pricing issue.
So yeah, the Camry Hybrid XLE, which is the loaded version, comes in at around 43 grand before tax, which is, decent for what it is, but then you have to look at the Sonata Hybrid, which is a little bit cheaper.
I don't look at that as a big deal. It's $1,000, right? Think about that over 72 months, right?
Right, so it's pretty much a wash.
Yeah, it's a wash there. It's a wash when it comes to fuel economy. The question becomes, would you take this over a four-cylinder version with the front-wheel drive or a four-cylinder version with all-wheel drive, considering the price difference?
It gets really hard to justify for me because it's hard to recoup those costs. It'll take such a long time.
But on the flip side, this is such a great car.
And it is my favorite Camry. I'll say it again and again. This is the Camry to buy. I just wish that pricing was a little bit better.
Okay, simple solution. We'll propose this to Toyota.
Okay.
Get rid of the four-cylinder version altogether.
And only offer hybrid or V6?
Yeah, I think that's the way to do it.
Yeah.
Because then they would have to lower the price of this version, and then if you wanted the gas version, you'd have to step up to the V6, and they could charge more for that, and people would pay, because if you want to play, you got to pay, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Boom. Toyota, we're telling you, this is the future. Listen to us. Don't forget to subscribe.
That too. It's good advice, Dan.
For sure. Okay, I think one other thing that is going to hold this back, though, no all-wheel drive.
Yeah, that's a good point too, considering how much Canadians love all-wheel drive. And the thing with the Camry is that I love it as a whole package. It's really good, but it has all these little details that are kind of annoying that kind of turn me off.
But with that all-wheel drive thing, it would be pretty easy to make it all-wheel drive. The RAV4 has all-wheel drive, the Highlander Hybrid, it's got that standalone battery. The only issue is it would cut into the cargo capacity, because that trunk is absolutely massive.
Oh yeah, I was really surprised to see Patty back there.
Yeah, so those of you who don't know, Patty is our pedal car, and we use her to test out the cargo capacity of the vehicles we test drive. And not many sedans can actually fit that pedal car directly in the trunk, but it was not an issue. I think you could actually probably fit two of them back there.
Yeah, that trunk is enormous.
You, even with the Sonata, had issues with the headroom up front.
Yeah.
This, as you can see, I've got no issues in here. I can sit in the back seat, no
Behind
problem.
yourself,
Behind
too.
myself.
Yep.
You could probably fit on top of your lap behind
I
me.
fit anywhere. I'm not very tall.
So that's the thing. Lot of good, a little bit of bad. Whether you're going to be willing to pay for it, I think, is going to be the big issue, the big sticking point with this car.
To recap, we like the steering, the suspension, and the silent operation of the Camry Hybrid.
We don't like the layout of the controls on the center stack, some of the plastics inside, or the fact this XLE version doesn't feel like the top trim should.
The Toyota Camry has always been one of the best mid-size sedans on the market, but this hybrid one really takes it further because it is by far the best Camry you can buy.
It's too bad it doesn't have all-wheel drive, and this top trim doesn't feel quite as upmarket as something like the new Sonata Hybrid, but it's got the quality and comfort you'd expect in a Camry with the added bonus of a whisper quiet drive and outstanding fuel economy.
So if you can stomach that extra cost over the 4-cylinder model and you're already shopping for a Camry, there's no reason not to get the hybrid one.